All right, and we are live today with the Friday book discussion of the week. I do these sessions on Fridays at noon every single week. This week we are talking about the book Decisive from Chip and Dan Heath, and it is absolutely fantastic. I've read some of their other works and it was great, and they were great, but this one was very, very applicable, and I'm really excited to get into kind of the nitty-gritty details of this for everybody who's out there. So I do want this to be a book discussion. I go through the book. This is the format of these sessions. I go through the book and I simply go through the parts that I highlighted that I wanted to kind of discuss and could take away and that could be applicable for any leaders out there, any frontline leaders that you could apply to your work. And so we'll simply go through all the highlights. I'll do some summarizing where absolutely necessary, and otherwise just lots of great things to pick up. Now I did want to mention that next week, next Friday at noon, we will be discussing the brand new book Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. Just came out, just hit my doorstep a couple of days ago. I think it came out on Tuesday, and so we will be discussing that. A fantastic book, I am sure, from her, because all of her books are absolutely wonderful. So again, getting into this book, Decisive. So the process behind this is, or the purpose of this book is to bring a little bit more clarity to our decisions, to help you make better decisions. Now, if you're like me, you look at a book like this and go, you know what, I'm pretty good at making decisions. And that's what I wanted to actually tackle right away, because they actually hit on this in the book right away. First of all, we are absolutely terrible at making decisions. Almost all of us are. That was a big revelation for me in this book. Oftentimes, and I've heard it said before, that we succeed in spite of ourselves, not necessarily because of ourselves. So with that in mind, there's a little tidbit of information here to kind of set the table that you can improve your decision-making process, that you can improve the decisions that you're making, and that you are probably falling under a few very obvious mistakes in decision-making that are all too common with people. But so, for some perspective on this, a study showed that when doctors reckoned that they were completely certain about a diagnosis, they were actually wrong 40% of the time. Doctors who were completely certain of a diagnosis were wrong 40% of the time from this study. Another study found that when a group of students made estimates that they believed had only a 1% chance of being wrong, students in particular fields who thought there's a chance of only 1% of being wrong, they were actually wrong 27% of the time. So many of the times where we are looking to make a decision, we think we know what's going to happen, we think we know what the right answer is, and it proves to be wrong way more than it proves to be right. So getting into some of the main, they call them the 4 villains, but this also creates the framework for the book. The process of the book is summarized with the acronym WRAP, W-R-A-P. Widen your options, reality test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding, and prepare to be wrong. So when kind of going through these and summarizing, and then these are the 4 sections of the book. They kind of dive right in. Really well done book from a story perspective. There are lots of examples, lots of studies. It's very applicable. My one big my one wish for you when you come to this book is to bring some decisions that you've been struggling with. Have some of those in your mind, and you can kind of work through those. There is a ton, and I meant to mention this right at the beginning. I usually don't go to a book's website and download the resources afterwards, but if you go to the Heath Brothers website, Heath Brothers, all spelled out, no bros at the end of it, Heath Brothers, and you can sign up for their email list, and you have access to download the resources for this book. There's a workbook in regards to making decisions if you have big decisions. There's a cheat sheet if you have simple decisions to make. But just a great way and a great reminder to keep these things in mind. And it was, like I say, an absolutely fantastic book to read through and very applicable. I'm going to go through some decisions this week. I'm actually going to try out the workbook here. 1.5 years ago, which live show, and I found them very successful. Thanks. You're a real help. Thanks, Jasim. I really appreciate that. I just do these to help out leaders out there, and I hope you get something from these live sessions, this live session, and all of my other work out there as I bump the camera here. So And getting into some of the details of WRAP, again, that 4-step process that they go through. Widen your options. How can you expand your set of choices with which you make a decision? 2, reality test your assumptions. How can you get set outside your head and collect information that you can trust? 3, attain distance before deciding. How can you overcome short-term emotion and conflicted feelings to make the best choice? 4, prepare to be wrong. I love that last one. Prepare to be wrong in the decision you make. How can we plan for an uncertain future so that we give our decisions the best chance to succeed? So WRAP, again, W-R-A-P, that is the framework with which they'll go through this. And there are, like I say, a ton of great little takeaways in this book. So the first step is to widen your decisions, or widen your options, as they say. And one of the main things that they discuss is that you have what they call narrow framing. You only give yourself a few options. Oftentimes, we are making decisions where there is only one option that we are considering. Well, then there's no decision to be made. Or we are going with a either-or sort of decision, and the challenge is to do an and decision. So instead of doing either-or, it's and. So you do two things at the same time. So different ways to widen your option set. The more options you have as far as your decision is concerned, the more likely you will have a successful outcome. There's lots of studies in here that discuss that exact fact. The more decisions you give yourself, or more choices you give yourself, the more likely the decision is to be correct, within certain parameters, of course. But first thing, in regards to the narrow frame. So when you have those decisions where you're really making one decision, or there's only one choice available to you, one of the main things they say is we should have a couple of people arguing the no side of the evaluation. He talks about Snapple was a beverage back in the 90s. It disappeared. And Quaker Oats actually bought the company for $1.8 billion, something crazy like that. And it was really a high valuation. People were really concerned about whether it was the right move for them or not. But when the CEO discusses it, and it turned out to be a complete, utter, horrible billion-dollar failure, when the CEO discusses it, there wasn't a single person in the boardroom that was arguing the other side. There wasn't a single person that thought it was a bad idea. And so what you want to do if you want to make better decisions is make sure that you have someone, even if it's yourself, arguing the other side of this. And we'll get into, again, some more details on it. Of the teams that he studied, going through some studies here, of the teams that studied, only 29% considered more than one alternative. Oftentimes, almost a third of the time, there's only one alternative that we are deciding against in that particular case. Whether or not decisions failed 52% of the time over the long term versus 32% for decisions with two or more alternatives. Again, choosing between one thing or the other thing fails over 50% of the time, but only a third of the time if you have more than two options available to you. Other thing is to learn to distrust, and that's the big, it's a big bugaboo. They hit on this over and over again because it's kind of the one thing, if you took it away, be aware, learn to distrust whether or not decisions. Either or decisions. You want to distrust those. When you find yourself deciding whether or not to do something, you see how quickly that flows off the tongue there? And that means it's very obvious, it happens very frequently in your world. When you come across yourself saying whether or not to do something, be on guard. Look for other options. That's a great indicator that you need to look for other things to be deciding between, or some other options available to you. Next comment that they had here, next tactic that they had is what they call the vanishing options test. So you might say, you know what, Cameron, that's great, all right, but I don't have a whole bunch of different options. All right, well, put yourself to the test. Really put yourself to the test. And one of the ways to do that is the vanishing option test. What if you cannot choose any of the current options you're considering? What else could you do? So let's say, and I'll make this really practical. Let's say that the options you're choosing, you do all of those, and they all fail. What else would you do? What else would you try? But you can do this ahead of time and say, okay, I've got these three things that I'm considering. What if I couldn't do any of those? What else could I do? And so you just go through the exercise of coming up with some different ways of tackling things. It's a form of brainstorming, but it's a way of brainstorming just amongst yourself without a team being necessary for that at all. One rule of thumb, great one. One rule of thumb is to keep searching for options until you fall in love at least twice. So many times we fall in love with a great option, not realizing there's an even better option lying on the other side of that. So keep searching for options until you fall in love twice. I love that. At least twice. You don't need a plethora of choices to improve your decisions. You just need one extra choice or two. So the purpose of this exercise of widening your options isn't so that you have a whole laundry list of things that you can consider. You're really just looking for 1, 2, maybe 3 more options that you consider. Because what's going to happen is it actually, you may go with the original choice that you had, but it makes that choice better for a variety of different reasons. But keep looking for just 1 or 2. You don't need a crazy amount, all right? Just some other options available to you. Yes, okay. So talking about what the term he uses in this case is multi-tracking. So in one case, it wasn't that they decided between 6 vendors for a project. This company deciding between 6 vendors for a contract, giving 1 to 1, and that person runs through with the project. What they did is they actually split it up. They took that project and broke it into a whole bunch of component parts, and they gave the first part to all 6. And depending on how they got along with that group, how that group worked, the output, whatever, then they refined it more. They actually went up to a second step where they had 3 of them, I think, go through the second step, and then they went with the initial one. And so what they called that was multi-tracking. Too many times we're looking to widen our options, all right? And we're looking to we want to widen our options, but we are too focused on having that narrow frame of mind. We want to decide between the 6, to use this particular example, and go with that. Whereas we can actually get more information, more applicable information, and make a better decision on which one to go with if we went with all 6 for that first initial stage. Yeah, we have a lot of duplicate work, but in the end, it can actually get done quicker and better if you go through this particular process. So talking about multi-tracking. And so one of the big concepts of multi-tracking is oftentimes when we hit a crisis, I won't even say a crisis. We've got 2 frames of mind. If you're in a company, there is the cost containment side of things, and then there is the opportunity and sales side. There is the defensive. Let's keep our costs contained on that so we maintain our profit margin. And then there's the more aggressive. Let's go out and get some business into this company. Let's drop our pricing so that we can get more market share, which will help us in the future, that sort of thing. So you have that defensive, offensive mindset. And so one of the examples that they could use is calling it a blended mindset. So you do both of those things at the same time. So instead of looking to cut costs 5% across the board, and that's the decision that's being made, what if you could cut costs by 8% in certain areas and reinvest 3% of those cost savings into new opportunities? So you're doing both things at the same time. Where are those options available to you? And this is something, I look back on 10 years ago in the Great Recession when we laid off 20% of our workforce. What if, and just a mind exercise, but what if we had laid off 25% and we could reinvest some of that capital elsewhere to improving the business? What could have happened? And we look at that, when you go through recessions, there's those that are very defensive during recessions and cut costs, and there are those that try to be aggressive and get some market share during those times. What they find is that neither one of those performs as good as those that have a blended mindset where they do reduce costs, but they also make investments. It isn't an either or, it's an and that gets to kind of reiterates that particular point to things. Next comment that I wanted to have is if you want to widen your options, all right, and that's the big thing, and I'm glad they tackled this first. If you want to make better decisions, you need to have better options. And, truth be told, sometimes quantity is what you're looking for. Just more options will help you make a better option. So in this case, look at ways, whatever problem or opportunity you're facing and how you want to address it, look for other places, look for other people who have already been there, who have solved this particular problem. Other people who have taken advantage of this opportunity. I guess they use a couple of examples, and I'll probably get to one of them here, and if not, then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of summarize it for you. Well, I'll get right to it. One of the big things was Sam Walton, who founded Walmart. Sam Walton would go to different competitors of his and see what they were doing, see how they were displaying product, see how they were running their operation. They talk about how he drove 800 miles on a bus to go visit a Ben Franklin store up in Minnesota where they had one single checkout person. See, back in the day, you would check out departmentally. So let's say you're at the grocery store, you would check out of the meat section when you got your hamburger. You'd check out of the produce section when you got your vegetables. Then you go over and check out of the bakery when you got your bread. So you'd check out 3 different times. This Ben Franklin had everybody going to one centralized checkout area at the front of the store. And so he instituted that in his stores. But look for people that have already solved your problem, are already tackling your opportunities. Look for your competitors, but also look outside of just your competitors. Look for, they say the use of analogies is one of the main mechanisms for driving research forward. Search for other problems that have been solved. So it may be other industries. If you're working in a warehouse, you're working on a production line. Well, darn it, you know what? A factory that has a production line could give you some indication on what you could do to solve a particular problem in just your shipping warehouse. You're not producing anything, you're just shipping things. But there's a similar process flow to it, and anybody that has a process flow could be somebody that you could learn from. So if you want to make better decisions, you want to widen out your options, look around you. Look to competitors, look to different industries, and they will all give you different ideas with which you can use to widen your options. So again, I'm not going to summarize each one of these sections. Heathbrothers.com, you can get kind of the summary for this, and it's something I encourage you to do. Again, I'm not somebody that runs out to the book's website when I finish. Very, very, very rarely do I. But there's some good tools there as far as making good decisions that you can apply personally and professionally. So I'm not going to summarize, but I am going to move on to the second aspect of it, which is reality test your assumptions. So to make better decisions, again, 4 areas. Widen your options, reality test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding, prepare to be wrong. All right, 4 things, WRAP, W-R-A-P is the acronym for it. So looking to reality test the assumptions. Love this particular chapter, had a lot of great points in it. And part of it is getting out of our own way, stopping ourselves from making mistakes. And one of the things that happens is we get, our own preferences get in our way. And so we'll talk about a few of those things. First comment is if we feel a whisker's worth of preference for one option over another, we can be trusted to train our spotlight on favorable data for that particular option. So if there's any preference that you have, and I'll use the example, if you have a preference for things that don't take as much time, well, then you will naturally look, you'll shine a spotlight, you'll pay more focus and more attention to those things that tell you that to work quicker. You won't train your spotlight on the alternate viewpoint, which is you need to work slower so you have better quality, and that better quality yields better time results over time. An example on that. But if we have a whisker's worth of preference over our options, we can be trusted to train our spotlight on the things that shine a good light on that option that we have a preference for. All right. Develop the discipline to consider the opposite of our initial instincts. That discipline begins with a willingness to spark constructive disagreement. All right. So develop the discipline of, even though you're sure that you want to do this, what is the devil's advocate point of view to it? What is the opposite point of view? What is the argument against what you're doing and for something else? Even just taking the time to consider that for half a minute, 1 minute, will prevent us from making mistakes. And remember, I'll come back to this many times, doctors who were absolutely certain of their diagnosis were wrong 40% of the time. Doctors about a diagnosis in medicine were wrong 40% of the time. How wrong are you in many of the decisions that you make? That 1 minute to play devil's advocate, to think about the other side, can be something that saves you hours or days putting pieces of the puzzle back together after a wrong decision. The most important lesson to learn about devil's advocacy isn't the need for a formal contrarian position. It's the need to interpret criticism as a noble function. All right? So it isn't about having somebody else role play against you. The most important thing is realizing that process in and of itself is something that is noble and yields better decisions. It helps you from getting too personal with the other person, but it also reinforces the need to be critical of your own decisions and your own preferences in regards to things. One of the things that you want to ask yourself, one of these kind of hack questions that they have in this book, and they have a bunch of them, is what would have to be true for this option to be the right answer? And so the scenario in this is it's a board who's going through a bunch of different things, and what happens is what happens in most of your meetings, and that is that people take different sides of an argument and they argue about it. And so what they did is instead of having people argue it, they took the two options and they basically, and all they said was, what would have to be true for this to be the best option? So the next time that you are in some sort of disagreement that's going nowhere in a meeting, take both of those things, take both of whatever the options you're considering and say, what would have to be true for this to be the best option? That's just a way of kind of stripping down to first principles in regards to things. And what happens is, first of all, then everybody becomes collaborative instead of competitive within the meeting room environment, and you're actually able to start talking about facts, not necessarily opinions, and bringing the facts to the table. Try it out. What would have to be true for this to be the best option? Take the two of them and ask that question of both of them, and you'll often find that the answer to the question and the debate ends because it's obvious. Next comment, what if our least favorite option were actually the best one, or was actually the best one? What data might convince us of that? So the flip side of that, so we have the options that we want. Then we have the options that we absolutely don't want. What data could be present to make those options worthwhile or worth considering? This is almost a brainstorming function, and it's very difficult. And if you have an initial reaction against this, totally understandable, because it's hard to expend our energy on those things that we don't want to do, which kind of proves the point that if we have a whisker's worth of preference on something, we're going to look for the data that supports that particular opinion. Sometimes we think we're gathering information when we're actually fishing for support. This happens all the time out there. We're not actually getting more data. We're looking in the places that are going to support that data. All right? We're phrasing questions in a way that support a particular point of view or negate an opposing point of view. We look for those things. I want to say we can't be trusted, and that's kind of the subtext to this. We can't be trusted, really, with a lot of the data that we put together ourselves to inform our own decisions. And that's, I think, where some of it goes wrong, and we'll get to that right now. The outside view, what you want to do is take yourself kind of outside of yourself. And the example they use is Yelp reviews or TripAdvisor reviews. So you might look at the pictures. They use the example of a resort, and the rooms look beautiful, and the beach is beautiful, and the pool is magnificent, and you look at the menus in the restaurants, and your mouth starts watering. But then you read the reviews of people who have actually been there, actually have experience, call them experts. And you find out that the service is terrible, that the place is dirty, that the food is cold, that the beach is rocky and not as sandy as it looks. You find out that. Look for an outside point of view. Look for outside experts. The outside view ignores everything that is special about our situation. That's one of the big cheats that we use in justifying our decisions, is that our situation is special for some reason. If you take an outside point of view on things, look for an outside point of view, you will get the non-special version of it. All right. When you're trying to gather good information and reality test your ideas, go talk to an expert. And an expert can be somebody who's dined at that restaurant, the reviews. It can be the person who was in your position before you. That's another great resource. Hey, I just had this come up with the warehouse. How did you handle it? That's another point of view on things. You can go to your mentor, your boss, that can be viewed as an expert. Get an outside opinion on things. An expert, I love this, an expert is simply someone who has more experience than you. It doesn't need to be a person who wrote a book. It can be somebody who's been in your shoes before, or who simply has been in the workforce longer than you have. All right? They have more experience than you. Now, the caveat to that is that experts are great at assessing what they call base rates. So they're great at assessing, I want to say, things in the past, how things performed in the past, what the numbers showed in all of the data that came up. But experts aren't particularly good at predicting what's going to happen. Again, I'll come back to that doctors who are wrong 40% of the time. Now, there is a caveat to that, and that is that experts are better than novices at predicting things. However, they aren't phenomenal at prediction. So you go to experts to come up with different ideas, different options, and to reality test any assumptions that you are making. But be careful about allowing them to predict for the future. Again, you go back to, say, the stock market. You know, for every single stock, there is an expert who is paid hundreds of thousands of dollars who says it's going up. And then there's another one who's paid hundreds of thousands of dollars that says it's going to go down. So experts don't necessarily predict particularly great. However, they are good at giving you a little bit of a different look at the reality of a situation. So in short, when you need trustworthy information, go find an expert, someone more experienced than you. Just keep them talking about the past and the present in regards to the situation, not the future. All right? The advice to trust the numbers isn't motivated by geekery, it's motivated by humility. And this is trusting all the past data. So if you have data points, trust the percentages on whether something is going to work out or not. All right? This isn't you being geeky. This isn't you being chicken. This isn't you being cavalier. This is you being humble and saying, this is what happened in the past. It is likely to continue in the future. Right? Or it's at least more likely to continue in the future. It won't. And we'll get into kind of where to set that range here in a little bit as well. Moving on here. So when we zoom out, that's what we're taking the decision out. We're reality testing by zooming out and getting a different perspective on things. We're learning from the experience of others who have made choices like the one we're facing. When we zoom in, we're taking a close-up of the situation, looking for the color that could inform our decisions. So the flip side of going out and getting another point of view is to dive into some of the data and see what it really says. Look for different points of view to it. So another example that is used, I'm trying to come up with, it was in regards to reviews. And I've done this myself where, you look at the bad reviews. So maybe it only has 4 stars out of 5. So you go into the 2-star and 3-star reviews and see what happened. And it could be that, they rated the resort poorly because the weather rained the entire week that they were there. Well, that had nothing to do with the resort. So you dive into some of the details and see if there's conflicting information within the details. That's the second principle. So you zoom out and zoom in, and that gives you better color for the decisions. The other way to reality test your decision is to what they call OOCH. Apparently it's a southeastern term. I'd never heard of it before. But it is to do a small test. To OOCH is to construct small experiments that test one's hypothesis. So you come up with small, test beds. If you want to try a training, instead of rolling it out to the 100 employees that you have, try the training with a group of 10 and see if it affects their performance. That's a great way of doing it. Another way to OOCH is just to do a trial run on something. I just had a coaching client I spoke to yesterday who was considering a few things with his team. And I'm like, well, try it. If it doesn't work out, you can just change it back to the way that it was done before, changing up some procedures where people were focused with their time over the course of a week. Try it out for a couple weeks, see what happens, learn from it, and then if it doesn't work out, you can always go back. I love the OOCH. That's a great way to reality test any assumptions. All right, we tend to be awfully confident about our abilities to predict the future. And that's just a great little warning that we think once we've gone through a process, gotten our data and everything else, that we know what's going to happen. But again, we prove over and over again that we aren't nearly as good as we think we are. By making decisions through experimentation, the best idea can prove itself. Forget the academic, discussion of going through things. And many of you are part of organizations where they've gone and they've discussed something for 2 months before they do it. Well, they could have done a little test run for 2 weeks and known whether something was going to work or not and saved themselves a month and a half. All right, let the best ideas prove themselves through little test runs. All right, ooching is the best for situations where we generally need more information. All right, ooching in short should be used as a way to speed up the collection of trustworthy information. So we're testing it out to see if it works, finding where it works better than we thought, finding where it works worse, and making tweaks along the way, not as a way to slow down a decision that deserves our full commitment. So ooching or doing little test runs doesn't work for everything, not all situations. Sometimes you need the full commitment of everybody in the organization to get something going. And the test runs would just be delaying that. Okay, so it's not a method of delaying. It's looking to gather information in an effort to speed things up, actually. There was another way that they brought up the test runs is they brought it up in regards to interviewing. And again, it's one of those things where we think we're better than we are, and this hurt because I think I'm pretty good at interviewing people. I have a lot of experience interviewing people. But you look back on that track record, and there's an example that I come up with all the time, or might bring up, and that is I hired 3 particular people for a position one time about a decade ago. And I was really sure that the top person was going to be great. The middle of the road person I thought was going to be middle of the road. And the third person was a little sketchy, and I thought I was taking a risk with hiring him. And it turned out to be the exact opposite. The middle of the road person was middle of the road between the 3. But the person I thought was going to be perfect, that had the perfect background, the interview great, was horrible. And the person I thought I was taking a big risk on turned out to be fantastic and was promoted 9 months into the job and then another 9 months after that. And so they had a hugely successful career. We're not as good as we think on this thing. And so you want to try to do a trial run. And I've done this before at call centers where the first interview was actually a telephone call where you could hear what they were on the phone, because that's where it was, where the work took place was over the phone. So you gave them a trial run. But the example they use here, not a fair example, but one that just kind of rings true, is, let's say, by way of comparison, imagine if the U.S. Olympic track coach used two tests in selecting the men who'd run in the 4x100 relay. First test was get the man on the track to see how fast he runs. The second test was meet him in a conference room and see if he answers questions like a fast runner would. Well, duh. But too many times we don't look at how they would actually work in situations. And yes, it is a challenge to set up that environment. It's a challenge to set up a test scenario for a phone call. All right, but it's absolutely doable. You can absolutely do it. Keep that from ringing. So reality test your assumptions. So the first step in making better decisions is to widen your options. So come up with 1, 2, or 3 options. All right, a few different ways of doing this here in the book. Second thing is to reality test your assumptions. Play devil's advocate. Have somebody else look at it. Look to the experts and see what they would look to do. Try to do some trial runs of it. The third thing is to attain distance before deciding. Now, the first example they use in this is short-term emotion. And they talk about car salesmen and how they try to make it an emotional decision. They try to get you to sit in the car. Think about how it feels. Every sales manager that comes to you is going to tell you how good the decision is on the car that you'd selected, how great it is, even though they say that about every single car that they sell in that particular lot. They're trying to make it emotional. And one of the big challenges is to get out of that emotion. When people, to drive this point home, and I know this rings true of me and I'm sure it does of you, when people share the worst decisions they've made in life, they are often recalling choices made in the grip of visceral emotion. Anger, lust, anxiety, and greed. Those are when our worst decisions are made. So you want to separate yourself from that short-term emotion. Those are the worst decisions, but that doesn't mean that even when those particular emotions are present, that emotion is something that helps us make good decisions. One of the ways around that is to use what's called the 10-10-10 framework. Susie Welch came up with this. And it's, we think about our decisions in 3 different time frames. So think about the decision that you're making. How will it how will we feel about it 10 minutes from now? How about 10 months from now? How about 10 years from now? How will we feel about this decision? And so it gives that frame of reference, and it's just kind of that check on what you do. It's kind of the rocking chair test. Would you be happy you did or didn't do this when you're sitting on your rocking chair when you're 80 years old? Well, that's a bias for action on it, but this 10-10-10 gives a little bit more of a frame of reference for it. 10 minutes, what was it? 10 months and 10 days. Yes, there you go. 10 months and 10 years, sorry. 10 minutes, 10 months, 10 years. How are you going to feel about the decision that you're making? The other thing about emotion is, again, our cognitive kind of dissonance with what's going on. People develop a preference for things that are more familiar. Psychological thing wired into the neuroscience of our brains. We are more comfortable and have a preference for, because of that, for things that are more familiar. Repetition often sparks trust. Those people that we are with more repeatedly, we will likely have more trust in than a complete stranger off the street, even if the person that we meet with has proven themselves distrustful over the years. The other thing, well, I'll dive right into it. There was a hit on this in regards to change management. That I wanted to hit on, and that is when an organization's leaders propose a change in direction, people will be feeling 2 things. That feels unfamiliar and thus more uncomfortable. Unfamiliar is uncomfortable. Also, we're going to lose what we have today. When you put these 2 forces together, the mere exposure principles and loss aversion, what you get is a powerful bias towards the way things work today. Part of the reason people are naturally wired to fear change. And so that repetition and that familiarity isn't just something that makes us more comfortable. It makes us very afraid of losing that. So it isn't just that the change that you're going to have is uncomfortable, it's that we're losing something. We feel like we're losing the way that things were before. And so that's kind of a double whammy emotion thing for change management. One of the ways to get over that short-term emotion and get a little bit of distance before deciding is to separate yourself from it, that distance, and ask yourself, what would I tell my best friend to do in this situation? Or what would I tell a peer who works in my organization what to do about this particular situation? Really separate yourself out and say, what would I tell them to do? They use the example of dating. You know, I don't know if I'm going to ask this girl out or not. Well, what would my friend tell me to do? Your friend would tell you to go for it, usually. So take away some of those doubts, but get that distance. That's another one of those little hack questions that they have in this book. The other thing to do to get some distance before deciding is to get out of that emotion and get back into your core principles. All right, what are your core priorities as a person? What drives you? What kind of person do you aspire to be? What do you believe is best for your family in the long run? The business leaders might ask, what kind of organization do you aspire to run? What's best for your team in the long run? Ask yourself those big core priority and principle questions and align those with the decision that you're making, and that may prevent you from making the wrong decision. That's the one that I know with every single corporate scandal that's out there, we wish that people would have asked themselves, is that really the organization that you want to be running? Is that what you aspire to be? If you ask those things ahead of time, you can prevent yourself from making some mistakes and some things that don't align with your core principles. So moving on to the last section. So first, we widened our options. If you want to make better decisions, give yourself more options to choose from. That's going to be helpful. Second is reality test the assumptions. Give it a trial run. Look to what the experts did, people who've done it before you. Ask somebody else what they would do. 3, attain some distance before deciding. What would you tell a friend to do? All right, separate yourself from the emotions of the situation. Realize that those are taking place. And also take a look at ways in which you can honor your core priorities. Get in touch with those core priorities before you make a decision. That will be something that helps out as well. And then the fourth thing is prepare to be wrong. And again, I will go back to that. 40% of doctors who said that they were absolutely certain of a particular diagnosis were wrong. 40% of doctors diagnosing things. All right, you are going to be wrong in the decisions that you make, but you can prepare yourself ahead of time for that. One of the most important things is what they call bookending the future. And they use this as something that's used with stock traders all the time. They don't try to predict where, the really successful ones, don't try to predict exactly where they think a stock price is going or what's going to happen with the future, what productivity gains you're going to get in the future. Maybe that would be one that comes in. What they do is they bookend it. So if everything goes right, what should I expect? Okay, now if everything goes wrong, what should I expect? And so what you do is you come up with a range, and that's kind of the takeaway from this, and that is the future isn't a point, it's a range. So when you make decisions, your expectations shouldn't be a particular point. I expect a 5%. That may be it. But what happens if everything goes wrong? Well, then I lose 5%. All right, we get a 5% decrease in productivity. Well, what if everything goes right? Well, then we have a 20% increase in productivity. Well, then that makes sense. All right, you got -5 and a +20, you're going to be in that range. All right, but what if you were expecting a 5% gain and you say, okay, if everything goes right, there's going to be a 7% gain. But if everything goes wrong, there's going to be a 10% decrease in productivity. Well, then you might cause some pause. That 5% that you predicted, A, may not be particularly right, because it's not near the middle, but you have a big downside to it. And so that's something to consider. So bookend the future. I really like that concept when you're trying to predict the future, which we know we're bad at, but you can predict yourself a range a little bit, and that can be something that's helpful. The other thing that I really liked is using prospective hindsight to work backwards from a certain future. When people do this, they are better at generating explanations for why events might happen. So again, similar to bookending, but to get into some of the details of what can go right and what can go wrong and what are those levers that you can pull to it. And it might be, okay, so we go forward with this process. We are expecting anywhere from a 5% decrease in productivity to a 20% increase in productivity. Let's say everything goes great. It goes even better than expected. We get a 25% lift in productivity. What would have contributed to that? How would that have taken place? And so when you talk of certainty, it's easier for whatever reason in our minds to come up with the step-by-step. Flip side of that. Let's say we go forward with this project and everything goes wrong and we end up with a -10% on our productivity decrease. What would have happened that would have caused everything to go so horribly wrong? And that gives you the template of things that you need to be wary of, the things that you need to come up with some contingency planning on. Those are those certainty questions that will help you book in that and then help you give some details to that. I love that principle. So the other thing to do, and this gets into like project management almost, but it's one that I hadn't actually heard, and I'm surprised I haven't heard it before because it seems so obvious. All right. So for each potential failure, you're looking at a project, you're looking at a new directive, you're looking for whatever's out there. So for each potential failure, they ask two questions. So this could go wrong, whatever else. All right. First is how likely is it, and how severe would the consequences be? All right, and you grade this on a scale of 1 to 10. So let's say, there's an earthquake and it's going to, destroy our building. All right. Likelihood of that taking on a scale of 1 to 10 is like, 0.0001. All right. But what is the effect of it? The effect's a 10. It's a horrible effect. And what you do is you take all of these, that's an extreme example, but little things like, people don't take to the, training like we had hoped to. The system is a little bit slower than we expected. Lead time is a little bit longer for this new supplier. Whatever those problems are, how likely is it to take place? And then what are the effects? And what you do is you simply multiply those two things together to get a total. And the highest totals, those are the ones that are the most severe potential failures. Those are the ones that get the most attention. So how likely is it to take place? And what is the effect if it does occur? multiply those two things together. If you do that for all of the things that can go wrong in a particular project, then you identify your top things that you need to come up with contingency plans for. I just really like that, and I can't believe I hadn't heard of something like that before, because I'm a big fan of contingency planning, and I'm a big fan of just taking, the top 3 or 4 things that could go wrong, but there's a little bit of an intuitive assessment of what those top 3 or 4 things are, and this is a great way of isolating that and bringing a little bit more definitiveness to that assessment. All right. Nope, I'm skipping that point. There we go. Even when we can't minimize bad outcomes, we still do ourselves a favor by considering them. So what happens is, you have those things like earthquake. I use that as an example. There's nothing that we can do to solve that. However, just considering them does us a favor. It gives us, a moment of consideration more than we would have had if we didn't consider it at all in the first place. The other concept that I really liked as far as decisions is the concept of setting a tripwire. So you come up with a decision that you want to try a new career. Okay, let's say you want to try working from home or something like that. Well, give yourself some tripwires. I will replace the income that I was making in my day-to-day work by year 2. Or I'm going to try this new thing and I will only invest $5,000. You set a tripwire and you set it ahead of time. So you get out of the emotion of having this thing carry on over and over. You give it the thought and you set the tripwire ahead of time. Because day-to-day change is gradual, even imperceptible, it's hard to know when to jump. Tripwires tell you when to jump, either into a situation or out of a situation. You can set these things up for positive things as well. I'll increase my ad revenue when we reach this point in sales. So you set those tripwires up ahead of time. That allows you to think about them without the emotion. And so it helps you make those better decisions down the road. You can set deadlines for it. That's another great way of doing it. Skipping that particular part there. The other effect of tripwires in doing this ahead of time, and so kind of deciding ahead of time in regards to things, how much time, many resources, that sort of thing you're going to give to something, is that they allow us the certainty of committing to a course of action, even a risky one, because we know when it's going to stop or when it's going to double down or whatever else. We can be committed to it. We can get that worry out of our minds a little bit. So it minimizes the cost of that overconfidence. It allows us, by setting those tripwires, to move confidently without having that concern. And the example I use with this is I would always try, when rolling out a new system or rolling a new process out to the workforce, what is the worst case scenario and what am I going to do? So let's say we're rolling out a new system and it sucks and it doesn't work and we have to go back to the other one. How am I going to do that? When I was clear on what I was going to do in the worst case scenario, it gave me the confidence to boldly move forward. It gave everybody on the team the confidence to boldly move forward with that, because we weren't worried, hey, what if the worst thing happens? We're prepared. We know exactly what we're going to do in that particular situation. The other thing, and this is, I almost want to say misplaced in the book. I think this was almost more of a reality test on things. But when we're talking through decisions with team members, and they have this in the trusting the process section, is you want to, that when people hear you explaining their plans, so people come to you and they say, you know what, I think you're making the wrong decision. I think we need to do this course of action. What you do in those cases is you actually reiterate what their plan is, and maybe a couple of things that are good about their plan that they didn't mention to you. Then you mention your plan, and you mention a couple of faults to your plan that they didn't mention before. Even stating all of that makes them much more comfortable, even if you don't change your mind in regards to it. It lets them know that you clearly understand what it is that they are talking about, the options that they are presenting, and that you have considered that, and even with that consideration, you are coming up with this other plan, or the whole team's deciding to go in a different direction. Trusting the process in regards to that. So again, the WRAP model in regards to decision making. You want to widen your options, all right, to make better decisions, come up with some more options. 2, reality test the assumptions. Do some trial runs. Ask for expert opinions. Look elsewhere for more data. 3, attain distance before deciding. Try to take some of the emotion out of the situation as much as possible. Ask yourself questions like, well, what would I recommend a friend do in this situation? Number 4, prepare to be wrong. All right, so set up those ranges. Don't set one particular goal and one particular finite point in the future. Come up with a range that's going to be more likely to prepare you for whatever happens in the future. As we found out, doctors were wrong 40% of the time in diagnoses. And I'm like, I'd love to know the details of that test because I can't imagine that's completely right across the board. But in that study, it certainly was. So you will be wrong in some of the decisions you make. Can you prepare for that ahead of time? So again, Decisive, great book, great application. Come to this book with some decisions that you know that you need to make. It'll help you apply some of those principles. And then check out heathbrothers.com, has some great resources. This weekend, I'm going to be going through some of those resources with some of the decisions that I have to make to just bring a little bit more confidence to the decision that I do make. So again, next week, Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. That's next up, noon, Friday. I will see you then. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.